Fear has a way of becoming your entire existence, wrapping around your life until you can't remember what it felt like to breathe without it. For me, that suffocating cycle began the evening I turned 12 years old. I don't recall cake or presents or anything remotely joyful about that day. What I do remember is sitting cross-legged on my mattress, palms pressed hard against my ears, desperately trying to block out the violent arguing that echoed through our small apartment. And I remember the face of the intruder who came through our door that night. My younger brother was sleeping in the twin bed across from mine. He woke up screaming like someone was hurting him, and that's what brought our father running into the room. At first, I kept my eyes squeezed shut because I was too terrified to look. When I finally forced them open, there was someone standing near the doorway, staring directly at me. Dark, empty eyes, a thin and colorless face that showed no emotion whatsoever. I watched our father charge at the stranger, and then he collapsed onto the carpet, bleeding. The next memory I have is our mother rushing in, shrieking, and when I looked again, the intruder had vanished. Here's the thing about intruders. They're supposed to leave evidence. For years, nobody believed my version of what happened. The detective said it was probably some addict looking for valuables to steal, but they couldn't make sense of how this person got inside. Every window was still latched. Every door was still locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry anywhere. Everything changed after that night. Our mother essentially checked out mentally. She was physically present, moving through the apartment like a ghost, but there was nothing behind her eyes anymore. I harbored a lot of anger toward her for that. My brother and I needed her desperately, but instead, we effectively lost both parents at once. My own relationship with substances started by watching her. She called them her little helpers, those oval tablets in shades of blue and lavender that she took multiple times daily. They transformed her into someone we barely recognized. My brother took it harder than I did, because he was only 8. He couldn't understand why Mom's voice sounded so strange and slurred when she was using. He couldn't comprehend why she'd stay in bed for days at a time, leaving us to fend for ourselves before school. He didn't understand why she passed out cold during a meeting with his teacher, which led to social services removing us from her custody. Eventually, she managed to pull herself together, just enough to regain custody of us. For maybe 3 weeks, I glimpsed the woman who used to be our mother, but that didn't last. The pills came back with a vengeance. I was 17 when I saw her for the final time, right before they committed her to a psychiatric facility. By then, I'd learned from the master. It started with me stealing her pills whenever she was too far gone to notice they were missing. Before long, I'd graduated to heroin, which has been part of my daily routine for the past 18 years. My brother never had a fighting chance, growing up with a mother and an older sibling who were both addicts. Being younger, he must have felt even more isolated than I did, so I understood the darkness he was living in. The last time I'd seen him in person, he'd run away from his group home, and I gave him cash so he could disappear properly. Several years passed before I heard his voice again. He called me one afternoon, completely hysterical, saying that our father's death was his fault. He begged me to come see him because he refused to explain over the phone. The address he gave me led to a condemned building that squatters had taken over. The place was crawling with rats and falling apart. I had to climb through a broken window at the rear of the structure to get inside. If you wanted to picture hell on earth, this was a strong candidate. Misery seemed to radiate from the crumbling walls. The air was thick with the stench of vomit and unwashed bodies as I moved through those dark hallways, searching for my brother. At the end of one corridor, I found a door that was closed. When I pushed it open, the smell of death hit me immediately. My brother's body had already gone cold. The syringe was still lodged in his arm. I felt completely numb, incapable of crying, but internally I was screaming. Next to where he lay was a folded piece of paper with my name scrawled across it. Inside he'd written just 4 words. "This wasn't your fault." After the paramedics removed his body, I decided to stay in that squat for a few days since I was between places anyway. My brother had taped old photographs to the wall near where I found him, pictures of us from when we were kids, when life was still normal. I could still sense his presence in that awful room, and I didn't want to abandon him in such a cold, dark place. The room had a closet, the only piece of furniture that remained. I checked inside hoping my brother might have stashed more drugs there, but it appeared empty except for an opening in the back wall. The opening led to some kind of passage. It confused me completely. The tunnel looked impossibly dark and seemed to stretch on forever, even though the room on the other side of that wall should have been right there. I climbed in and started crawling through the long, narrow space. It went on much longer than made any logical sense, but eventually I saw light ahead. When I emerged, I found myself inside another closet, and I stepped out carefully, and immediately a familiar scent hit me, something warm and comforting that I remembered from childhood. I'd been in this room before. Tears started forming as memories flooded back. It was my old bedroom, the one I'd shared with my brother all those years ago. I moved quietly through the rest of the apartment. Downstairs, I found our father's worn leather recliner in the corner, and beside it was the morning newspaper he always read before leaving for work. My eyes went wide and my pulse started racing when I noticed the date printed at the top of the page. It was the morning of my 12th birthday, just hours before our father was killed. I found myself back in the squat, struggling to process what I just discovered. Maybe this was what my brother had wanted to tell me about. Maybe this was an opportunity to go back and change everything for the better. This was a chance to return and stop the intruder before he killed our father. I waited until after dark before heading back through the tunnel, this time carrying a pistol I'd acquired years ago. My heart hammered against my ribs as sweat poured down my face. Even with the heroin in my system, the combination of terror and anticipation was almost unbearable. I kept moving until the light at the tunnel's end appeared again. I stayed hidden behind the closet doors, listening, not emerging, until I heard our father shouting. I expected to find him fighting with an intruder, but when I burst out of the closet, the monster I discovered was our father himself. He was beating my brother viciously as the 12-year-old version of me sat on the other bed with his hands over his ears. For just a moment, I locked eyes with my younger self. I could feel the raw fear emanating from him as my brother screamed for it to stop. Our father's face showed a mixture of terror and confusion as I screamed at him to get away from my brother. He lunged across the room toward me, and without thinking, I fired. He dropped to the floor. I could hear our mother screaming as I dove back into the closet and scrambled through the tunnel. When I made it back to the squat, my mind was reeling, trying to process what had just happened. That's when I finally understood what my brother's note meant. This wasn't your fault. He'd already been through that tunnel. He'd already gone back. He was the intruder with the empty eyes and expressionless face. At least he was the one who killed our father. And now, so was I. The monster we remembered wasn't a stranger at all. It was us, going back to save ourselves from a truth we were too young to understand. Our father wasn't murdered by an intruder. He was killed by his own sons, traveling back through time to stop him from doing something far worse. We created the very trauma we were trying to prevent. We became the monsters we spent our entire lives fearing, and there was no way to undo it, because it had already happened. It was always going to happen. We were always going to find the tunnel. We were always going to go back. We were always going to pull the trigger. The cycle was complete, and I finally understood why my brother couldn't live with what he'd done. Some doors, once open, can never be closed again. When I was around 24, I started seeing someone I'd gone to high school with. We'll call him Marcus. We hadn't really known each other back then, just passed in hallways, and maybe shared a class or two. But now, years later, we reconnected through mutual friends and decided to give dating a shot. Those first few weeks were pretty standard. Getting coffee, long conversations that stretched into the early morning hours, sharing stories about our lives. You know how it goes when you're getting to know someone. You trade experiences, talk about the things that shaped you, the moments that stuck with you, even when you wish they hadn't. One night we were at his apartment, just talking on the couch, with some documentary playing in the background that neither of us were really watching. The conversation had drifted to memorable experiences, and I found myself telling him about something I'd witnessed when I was 14 years old, when it wasn't something I talked about often, but it felt natural in the moment. I'd been at the Riverside Inn, this dated hotel on the edge of town, with an outdoor pool that was popular with locals during summer. I was there with my older cousin Rachel, my Aunt Kim, and her boyfriend at the time, a guy everyone called Smitty because of his last name. We'd spent most of the afternoon in the pool, just goofing around, trying to stay cool during a particularly brutal heat wave. True, we were walking back to our room, still dripping wet and wrapped in towels, when we saw the ambulance and fire truck pull into the parking lot. Their lights were flashing, but the sirens were off, which somehow made it feel more ominous. Being stupid, curious teenagers, Rachel and I immediately wanted to see what was happening. Smitty, who had this morbid streak and loved rubbernecking at accidents, was more than happy to lead the way. When we got to the pool area, when they were doing CPR on someone, a teenage boy, maybe 17 or 18, laid out on the concrete. His lips were blue. I remember that detail so clearly, how blue they were against his pale skin. The paramedics were working on him frantically, and then they brought out this machine that was basically pumping his chest for him. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him away, but you could tell from the looks on everyone's faces that it wasn't good. We found out later that night from the front desk that he drowned. Just a kid, 19 years old, gone like that. It messed me up for a while. That was the first time I'd ever seen death up close, or at least the immediate aftermath of it. You don't forget something like that. Marcus had gone really quiet while I was telling this story. When I finished, he just stared at me for a long moment before saying, "What hotel was this?" "The Riverside Inn," I said, "out on Highway 47. "On why?" His face had gone pale. "What year?" I told him. It would have been about 11 years ago at that point. Summer, middle of July. He set down his beer and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I was there that day," he said quietly. "I was at the pool when it happened." The coincidence hit me like a physical thing. I felt this weird chill, despite the warmth of the apartment. He explained that he'd been there for a birthday party. Some kid named Trevor from our school district. Though I'd gone to a different middle school than Marcus, so I didn't really know Trevor well. But apparently there were several kids from the area there that day. When the emergency vehicles showed up, they'd all run over to see what was happening, just like I had. We'd been at the same place, witnessing the same tragedy, and never knew it. We were the same age, living in the same general area, and our paths had crossed without us ever meeting. It felt surreal. But that was just the beginning of the strange connections. We kept talking, and I mentioned where I was currently living, the Oakmont Apartments, this sprawling complex in Westfield, a suburb about 20 minutes from downtown. It was a decent place, nothing fancy, but affordable and close to my job. Marcus's whole demeanor changed. His shoulders tensed up, and he got this look on his face that I couldn't quite read. "I know those apartments," he said, his voice tight. "For I know them really well. I figured he'd maybe visited a friend there or something, so I started talking about the area. There was this nice greenway trail nearby, a little park with a pond where I'd go walking sometimes, but he cut me off. "I haven't been back there since I was 16, he said. "I can't go back there." The way he said it made my stomach drop. I asked him what he meant, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he started telling me about his older brother, Derek. For Derek had lived at Oakmont Apartments years ago, back when Marcus was in 10th grade. Derek had a son with his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Vanessa, and they had a messy custody situation. Derek was apparently the jealous type, couldn't handle that Vanessa had moved on and was seeing someone new. This new guy was spending time around Derek's son, and it ate at Derek constantly. On one day in March, Marcus remembered it was March because it was right after his 16th birthday. Derek went to pick up his son for his scheduled visitation. He showed up at Vanessa's apartment at Oakmont, and something in him just snapped. There was an argument, voices raised loud enough that neighbors heard, and then Derek pulled out a gun and shot Vanessa, killed her right there in the doorway of her apartment. Then he took his son, this little 4-year-old boy, went and drove to another unit in the same complex where Vanessa's new boyfriend lived. The boyfriend's name was Craig. Derek confronted him. There was another argument, more shots fired. By the time police arrived, it had turned into this chaotic scene. The details got murky in the official reports, but the end result was that both Derek and his son ended up dead. The little boy caught in the crossfire of his father's rage and the police response. Marcus's family lost a son and a grandson in one day. His parents never recovered from it. His mom had a breakdown that lasted months. His dad threw himself into work and then, years later, tried desperately to make up for lost time with Marcus, his only remaining child. And I'd been living in those same apartments, walking past those same buildings, probably parking near where it all happened. The complex was big enough that I didn't know which specific units were involved. But knowing it happened there, in the same place I came home to every day, made my skin crawl. We sat in silence for a while after he told me all this. 2 random tragedies, years apart, and we'd both been there for each of them. What were the odds? It felt like our lives had been orbiting around these dark moments, these points of violence and death, without us ever realizing it until now. I kept dating Marcus after that conversation. Part of me wondered if I should have seen it as a sign, know all these dark coincidences, but I pushed that feeling aside. He seemed like a good guy, and I felt bad for everything he'd been through. That was a mistake. Over the next several months, Marcus became increasingly controlling. At first, I thought he was just attentive, maybe a little worried because of his family history, but it escalated quickly. If I didn't text him back within 20 minutes, he'd start calling repeatedly. If I still didn't answer, he'd show up at my apartment unannounced, while I'm pounding on the door until I answered. Once I forgot to text him that I'd gotten to work safely. I worked the early shift at a medical office, had to be there by 7 in the morning. It was barely a 10-minute drive from my place. But when I checked my phone during my break, I had 15 missed calls and a photo he'd sent me. It was a picture of my car in the parking lot at work. He'd sent his friend Jason, who lived nearby, to drive by and check on me. The text with the photo said, next time answer your phone. I was worried sick. He went through my phone constantly. Text messages, photos, even my deleted photos folder. He'd check my Facebook searches to see if I'd been looking at any guys' profiles. He'd question me about coworkers, about how long I'd been at the grocery store, about why I needed to visit my parents without him. I felt like I was living under surveillance, like I had the overbearing, controlling father I'd never had growing up. I'll accept this was supposed to be my boyfriend. He wasn't even living with me, but he'd managed to make me feel trapped in my own life. After about 10 months, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke up with him, and thankfully he accepted it without too much drama. I think part of him knew he'd pushed too far, but for weeks afterward, I'd catch myself checking my mirrors while driving, wondering if he was having someone follow me. I changed my routine, took different routes to work, and stopped going to the places we used to go together. Looking back now, those coincidences we shared, being at that pool, the connection to those apartments, they felt less like fate and more like a warning I should have heeded. Sometimes the universe puts up red flags, and we're too caught up in the moment to see them for what they are. Back when I had just turned 22, I was working in what you might call a gray area profession. I provided companionship services that technically didn't cross any legal lines in my state, but the work still carried the same risks as more explicit arrangements because everything happened face to face. That meant I needed the same security measures as anyone else in the industry. Thorough screening, verification, the whole 9 yards. And let me tell you, even when you're operating within the law, the last thing you want is spending 4 hours in an interrogation room with some detective convinced you're either a criminal or a victim who needs saving. Time was valuable, and I had better things to do in my evenings than play 20 questions with law enforcement. I picked up the screening protocols fast by connecting with other workers through private online communities. The rules were simple and non-negotiable. No meeting anyone without references from other providers. And if they were brand new, I required government-issued identification. I was fortunate to have 3 housemates who knew what I did and completely had my back. I never brought anyone to our place under any circumstances. Someone always had my location and client details. I never got into anyone's car. No verification meant no appointment, period. One ordinary Tuesday morning, while I was going through my inbox like usual. Messages from regular clients went into one pile, verified newcomers with solid references went into another, and then there was this one guy claiming to be totally new to everything. Standard procedure. I told him I'd need to verify his identity before we could discuss scheduling anything. Instead of complying, he immediately started asking extremely graphic questions about specific acts. This is a massive red flag in any branch of this work. You're usually dealing with either law enforcement trying to build a case, or more commonly, some creep looking for free explicit conversation to get off on while wasting your time. I kept it professional but firm, telling him I didn't offer those services and didn't engage in that type of discussion. If he'd been more subtle about it, some clients have coded ways of asking about services without being vulgar. I might have referred him to someone whose offerings matched what he wanted. But his whole attitude was so off-putting that I wouldn't have recommended him to anyone. Reputation matters on both sides of this equation. When I rejected him, things turned ugly fast. He started flooding my messages with violent, graphic descriptions of what he wanted to do to me. He claimed he'd just create fake accounts to trick me into meeting him, and then he'd do whatever he wanted regardless. Now, angry responses to rejection weren't exactly rare in my line of work. That's why blacklists exist and get shared around. What most people don't realize is that providers in a city, or even across an entire region, stay connected through various networks to warn each other about dangerous clients. The community is tighter than you'd think. What really got to me was that this guy kept sending the same violent threats from multiple different accounts, one after another. Finally, I made the probably stupid decision to respond out of pure anger, to explaining that there would never be a scenario where nobody knew my exact location and who I was with. And even if somehow that did happen, I had people in my life who'd make sure the cops were the least of his problems. My boyfriend at the time, Marcus, was involved in some seriously sketchy stuff, and for once, that actually felt like an advantage. After the message, the threat stopped. I was unsettled but not panicking. This kind of thing came with the territory, and I added all his numbers to the community blacklist, warned the other workers I knew, and moved on. When the messages stopped, I figured he'd gotten bored and found something else to occupy his time. 2 weeks later, one of my housemates, Devin, mentioned something strange while I was having coffee that afternoon. He left early for his morning classes and noticed some guy standing on our front porch looking confused. This wouldn't normally be concerning since we lived in this enormous apartment complex next to the state university, easily 40 or 50 buildings with hundreds of units total. People constantly showed up at the wrong apartment, whether looking for themselves or friends. I'd even drunkenly walked into an identical unit in the wrong building, once at 3 a.m. We laughed it off, and Devin described him just in case he was scoping out places to rob, which also happened occasionally in the complex. Tall and lanky, around 6 feet, with blonde hair and a scraggly goatee that looked patchy and unkempt. I didn't think much of it until about a week after that. I had an evening appointment and needed transportation. I'd stopped using my personal vehicle for work since clients could potentially identify and track it. Instead, I'd started using a local cab service, and after a few rides, I kept getting the same driver, this guy named Rick. He figured out pretty quickly what I did, appreciated the generous tips, and we developed a friendly working relationship. I had his personal number on speed dial and knew his schedule so I could request him specifically. I liked the consistency and reliability. So Rick called to say he'd arrived at my building and asked if he could come up to use the bathroom, which was fine. He worked for a legitimate license company with background checks. I had his cab number memorized, now and he'd proven himself trustworthy over time. Rick came through the outer security door to our enclosed porch area, and I stepped back inside to let him follow me in. For context, our unit had 2 entry points, an outer door from the hallway that led to an enclosed porch space, then the actual apartment door accessible from that porch. As Rick stepped onto the porch, I walked back through the apartment door to hold it open. That's when I heard the outer door open again and an unfamiliar male voice. I couldn't make out the words initially, but Rick turned around to respond. I could still see Rick, but not whoever was talking to him. "Sorry, what was that? You're looking for who?" Rick asked, his tone casual. "I'm here to see Sophia," the voice answered. Rick's entire expression changed, his eyes going cold and suspicious. Sophia was the name I used exclusively for work, never with friends or in my personal life. One it bore zero resemblance to my actual name. My heart immediately started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I froze completely, unable to process what to do, but Rick was sharp and understood immediately that nobody should be showing up unannounced using that name. "Nah, man, wrong apartment. There's nobody named Sophia here," Rick said with a casual shrug. His body language relaxed, but his eyes still sharp. The man mumbled some kind of apology and I heard the outer door open and close. Rick came inside and I locked the door behind him with shaking hands. We exchanged this long look of mutual shock and confusion. I asked him to describe what the guy looked like. He said the guy was roughly his height, about 6 feet, with messy blonde hair, and what he called a really bad attempt at a goatee. He added that the guy was really thin, almost skinny. I told Rick that my housemate had described seeing someone matching that exact description on our porch the previous week. Rick reminded me to be careful, use the bathroom, and then we left for my appointment. Over the following days, I was genuinely freaked out. This couldn't be explained away as someone casing apartments for a break-in or having the wrong unit anymore. I started wondering if the threatening messages were connected to this stalker. I had no proof, and contacting police wasn't an option in my situation. In my city, law enforcement is worse than useless if you need to explain you're being stalked because of sex work. So I made sure my handgun stayed on my nightstand every night when I slept and kept it on me whenever I left the apartment. I'd gotten my concealed carry permit the month I turned 22, and it gave me just enough peace of mind to resume my normal routine for about a month. Around 5:30 one morning, I was sitting outside on our porch having a cigarette after a long night of partying that had involved way too much stimulants. I've been clean for years now and strongly advised against ever touching that stuff. The porch chair was positioned in this alcove-type space that made it impossible to see from the walkway leading to our building, and it also shielded my eyes from the harsh, early morning sunlight starting to come up. Then the outer door opened. My exhausted, chemically imbalanced brain struggled to make sense of what was happening. All 3 of my housemates had gone home to visit family for the holiday weekend. My unreliable boyfriend Marcus had been missing for several days, which wasn't unusual. Then I saw him, the stalker, tall and thin with that wiry build, messy blonde hair, and that pathetic excuse for a goatee. Ice water flooded my veins instantly. He turned and saw me sitting there alone on the porch. He looked genuinely shocked to see me, though I could tell he recognized me immediately. Fortunately, my brain chemistry at that particular moment kept my facial expression relatively blank and unreadable. "Hey, what are you doing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to reveal that I knew he'd been here before. "Oh, sorry, I'm looking for Pepper," he stammered nervously. My face apparently forgot to maintain its poker face at the moment, and I stared at this guy like he'd just spoken in tongues. You see, when there actually was a Pepper in the apartment. However, I seriously doubted she was expecting any visitors, considering Pepper was my dog. My gun was in my bedroom, not with me on the porch. He continued, his confidence seeming to grow. "Yeah, I'm here to see Pepper. Can I come inside?" That snapped me out of my confused state. I started screaming at him, while physically shoving him backward through the still open door out to the breezeway. "Absolutely not. You'll get off my property right now and don't ever come back. If I see you around here again, the first call I make will be to the morgue." He looked completely stunned by my reaction. I was so furious that I'm honestly surprised I managed to stop pushing him before I backed him straight into the stairwell. I went back to the porch area to stub out my cigarette, went inside, and locked both doors. Pepper was going completely insane having heard me yelling. She immediately calmed down once I was safely inside. I actually laughed thinking I should have just let him meet Pepper and see how that went. I don't think he realized it was the dog's name. He'd probably overheard it at some point while lurking around our building. I felt significantly better after that confrontation. I'd faced down the threat I'd been worried about and won the physical encounter. I was still uncertain whether the threatening messages were definitely connected, but I knew for sure now that he was aware of my work, despite never having been an actual client. At that point, being young and feeling invincible, I convinced myself that was the end of it. I went back to my regular life, partying, recreational drug use, work, and my terrible boyfriend Marcus. That situation didn't last much longer either, thankfully. About a month passed before Marcus came into the apartment, just after I walked home from the dive bar across the street. He had his own key and would show up whenever he felt like it. He threw a completely destroyed cell phone onto my bed. I asked him what happened. He said he'd spotted the guy I described lurking near the back entrance of my building on a bicycle when he was coming over. Apparently Marcus had approached him and asked if he knew which apartment Sophia lived in. The guy had actually smirked and given him my exact apartment number, asking if Marcus was about to go have a good time. That was all the confirmation Marcus needed that this was the creep who'd been stalking me. I'd also mentioned I wasn't certain if he'd sent those threatening messages. Marcus wouldn't give me specifics about what he did beyond making the guy unlock his phone, which revealed the original threatening conversation in a messaging app. Marcus had his hands in his jacket pockets at that point, and he excused himself to wash his hands in the bathroom. Since no body was ever reported found, and Marcus was an asshole but not a murderer, I'm assuming the guy received a much more physical lesson this time about staying away from me. It was probably brutal considering Marcus was a large, intimidating guy. After that incident, I never saw the stalker again or received any more strange messages from him. I'm still not entirely sure how he discovered where I lived, since I was generally very careful about privacy, or what his ultimate intentions were. It's likely he thought he was more intimidating than he actually was when he made those initial threats. But thinking back on actually seeing him in person makes me laugh now. I'm not tall, but I'm not a small woman either. I probably had 40 pounds on him easily, and definitely could have handled him if it came down to it. With all that said, don't do drugs, be extremely cautious if you're going to do any kind of sex work, don't date people involved in illegal activities, and stay safe out there. If you want someone who'll defend you, find a nice farm guy from rural areas. All the protective instincts without the serious addiction problems. To the rejected client who stalked me for months, let's never meet again.